Welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers. Welcome to the Repurposing Business podcast. Have you ever woken up and thought, wow, why didn't I realize this before? Why didn't I understand this so many years ago? And I've just had one of those moments in the last week that I realized something that should have been so obvious 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And in some respects I saw it, but in other respects I completely missed it. Let me back up a little bit. In 1981, I had to deal with this question of how do I have a regular job at Pricewaterhouse and lead a local church. Then I started consulting to mission organizations, and I had 3 jobs. How do I put these 3 jobs together? Fast forward, we moved to the United States, to Silicon Valley in 1986, still with Pricewaterhouse, and I felt God challenged me to start an organization that would blend these worlds together. We started the Institute then, going forward another 10 years in 1996. And I remember one day I was lying on the sofa, just relaxing on a Saturday afternoon. And God said to me, Brett, you have a hang up with capital. I'm like, why do I have a hang up with capital? Well, you've thought about the competencies you need to build the Institute, and capital isn't part of it. And so you have to rethink that. So I began to meet with people who were wiser, more seasoned, understood the world of capital, how capital was a resource for building the kingdom better than I did. And so that began a journey. And then about 10 years later, after we'd been taking hundreds of marketplace professionals, primarily from Silicon Valley, but also up in Seattle, Portland, LA, those kinds of areas, and we'd been taking them on journeys with us overseas, mobilizing them, equipping them, and getting them to have the delight and joy of seeing their business skills used to grow the kingdom of God. That was amazing, but there was still a problem. The problem was still this area of capital, investing, resources, generosity, and even greed. And so I put together one of the most difficult teachings that I'd done for quite a while, and that was in 2008. I started teaching on kingdom economics and how what happens here on earth is a reflection of what goes on in heaven, and how God has unlimited resources. But the challenge is, and still is, how do we steward, make manifest, bring about, see, come on earth what is actually taking place in heaven. Jesus taught us to pray, your will be done, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And so what does that look like when it comes to capital? Well, the aha I had this morning is around this topic, and I want to unpack it with you. In 2012, we moved out of a house we'd been renting in Saratoga, California for about 5 years, courtesy of some good friends of ours. And it was a lovely location. Many people came through the Repurposing Business training. We started our executive intensives there, and many people stayed with us. Staff worked with us. But there was a change of season that took place at that point in time in 2012, and I'm only getting an understanding of it now as I look back. Sometimes my problem is I'm 10 years ahead in my thinking, and the problem with that is that by the time other people are making money off the things that I thought about, I'm bored with them and I've moved on. So living in the future. But I missed this one because 10 years ago, roughly, in 2012, when we moved out of the house in Saratoga, there was a change in season. And I would equate it somewhat to the change in season that the nation of Israel had when they left Egypt. Now, when they left Egypt, they didn't leave penniless. They left actually carrying capital with them. The wealth of the Egyptians had been given to the Israelites, and they went out with gold, silver, riches, and so forth. So much so that when they built the tent of meeting, Moses had to say, stop giving, we have more than we need, even though they had built an elaborate structure. This was prior to the temple, as they traveled around the desert. In 2012, there was a change of season, and I'm only realizing it now. You see, many of the people, hundreds of people who'd been trained, who'd come to our place, who'd met at different locations in the Bay Area, the West Coast, remotely in the US and North America, Canada as well, many of them were single. They got married, perhaps 200 of them. They now have children. They're further along in their careers. And yet my focus was still on equipping, mobilizing people. But actually, there was a shift in the journey. And while I wrote about it in 2016 in this book, Transforming Society, there's a chapter there on the journey to becoming a transformer. I wrote about it, and I shared about it in South Africa. I wasn't actually that clear in sharing it with my friends in North America. And so I want to unpack that a little bit today, because there was a change in season for you, and should have been for our community as a whole. And this would apply to people who were in the marketplace generally. We met many people back in the 1990s, the 2000s, who really wanted to figure out how to integrate their career and their calling, their creativity and community. They wanted a life of convergence. They wanted their business to matter for God. They wanted their skills to be used to make an eternal impact. And that still is their heart's desire, but a couple of things have changed. One is they have more career responsibilities, so the equipping that was given to them through the repurposing business training, learning how to do business with God, actually benefited many people in their careers. Secondly, many have got married, not all of them, but many have, and now have 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4, 5 children. So the likelihood that people can operate in the same way is slim to none. They can't pick up and go. They can't go to India, Indonesia, South Africa, Madagascar, Zimbabwe, just at the drop of a hat, and go and spend a couple of weeks repurposing businesses in the marketplace. But they can do something else, and I've been slow to realize it. You see, in this journey of transformation that I cover in the book here, the Transforming Society book, I'll put up a diagram that just shows you this progression of going from somebody who themselves gets their thinking renewed to somebody who's a societal transformer is a deliberate progression. So let me unpack it. There are different stages in your life. Firstly, you have the household stage. You grow up in a household. You grow up in a home, whatever that home looks like. You have parents. None of us came by miraculous conception. And parents try to teach their kids things. Sometimes they do a good job, sometimes they do a bad job, but they teach them about discipline, about the value of money, about how to earn, or just life principles. So there's a household stage. Then there's an education phase. So your parents invest in your education. You perhaps invest in your own education. And there's an opportunity to grow. Then there's the work phase. People get a job, and your parents probably said, get a job. They don't say that so much to the current generation, but people have to do something. And so there's an investment in building skills. Then there's an entrepreneurial phase. Now, this doesn't happen for everybody. Some people are called to be in corporates and to stay there their whole lives and make a difference there. But for some, there's an entrepreneurial itch. In fact, 78% of college students say they want to start their own business one day, but actually only about 30% do. That's a statistic I read many years ago. I don't know what the stats are today. But there's a chance to think about multiple streams of income, getting passive income if you like, spinning off different types of businesses. Then there's a capital phase. So we've gone through household, education, work, entrepreneurship, and capital, where one can potentially, as I lay out in the book over here, join an investment collaborative, invest in new businesses, fund the scaling up of existing business, and then flow money through to things that will build the kingdom. And then you end up with the transformer stage, where you're actually investing in things that'll tackle big problems that God cares about. But there's a progression. So how did I miss it? Well, I saw it in theory. I wrote about it in the book. I taught in it. But I didn't see that actually there was a big shift in our repurposing business community, in our REAP community around the world. And by not putting this shift in front of the community, I did them a disservice. And let me unpack that a little bit. We've all been in churches or in gatherings where there comes a time when people talk about money and you think, I knew where this was headed. In my case, I didn't talk about money. What I did was I said, look, you need to be mobile. You need to keep your passport ready. You need to be willing to go to the nations. If God tells you to go, you need to pick up and go. If God says, go to Nigeria, go to Morocco, go to Egypt, as many have done with us, you should be willing to go. The challenge is that now you're a mom or a dad. You've got a couple of kids at home. You're dealing with school schedules. You might even be doing another startup or be at another phase in your career in a corporate. And when you hear Brett say, you should go, have you prayed about going, you feel guilty. And so you withdraw perhaps, or you think, man, I wish I could, but I can't. I've got to homeschool my kid. I've got to take care of day-to-day responsibilities. And so I should have put another opportunity, which is laid out in this book, and I'll put the charts up in front of you, which is to become a more generous giver so that God will increase your supply of seed, so that you can become a kingdom investor, so that we can invest progressively in things that will transform society. And this has become abundantly clear to me, that I failed to provide the many steps along the way. We always think about people who are going to invest in the kingdom as people who are doing $1 million here, 10 million there, 100 million there. And yeah, I believe we need a huge fund for societal transformation. But it can happen in smaller increments. And if in 2012, when we went through that season shift, I had said, look, you have something in your hands. It might just be a bit of jewelry from the people in Egypt. It might be some stock options. It might be some capital you've accumulated. You can start with small investments. We as a community can start to make small investments that can build up a portfolio of organizations that can transform society. So I failed to do that, failed to put that opportunity in front of people. Of course, we encourage people to be generous, and the repurposing business community was extremely generous, has been. So in our first 5 years, for example, as people gave to each other to go on mission trips, I mean, they gave millions of dollars to each other, which was fantastic. So there was a giving for mobilization. But we've never come to a place where there's been a giving for investment. And for investing in the very businesses that we've helped. We've worked with over 400 companies. Just yesterday, I received an email from our team in Madagascar, and they are targeting the French-speaking world because our training is now in French. We have the consultant manual, the operations manuals, the facilitator handbooks, the videos are subtitled, the exercises are in French, Transforming Society, Lemon Leadership and Convergence are all translated into French. They want to expand. I know it's going to take capital to open up new nations. There are, when last I looked, over 155 million French speakers in Africa, and that was 5 years ago. So that number is increasing. And I haven't put the investment opportunities, not just to open up new nations, but to invest in the businesses in the new nations. There are good investment opportunities in Madagascar, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Egypt, Nigeria. But we've never built a fund as the repurposing business community. So what's my challenge? Well, right now, what's brought this home to me is we're sitting with an opportunity where I've been raising funds for a project in an African country. And we're looking for $10 million. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's a chunk of change. That would give the investors a 40% equity stake in a business, for example. And then the owners of the project have agreed to put 10% into a societal transformation fund. It just struck me a few days ago, what if the REAP community took up that 40%? We would have a 50% investment in a development that would create 10,000 new jobs and be a core corporation, a called corporation that would be core to the transformation of the adjacent city. Not only so, but this is a model that we hope to replicate. If we can prove it out there, the goal is to replicate it across other cities in Africa where we can impact. The goal is 100 million people. So this is not a small situation. And if I'd recognized the change in the season 10 years ago, we could have worked our way up to that. Now we stand in front of an opportunity. This happens to be one of them. There are others that I'm involved in as well, in different nations, South Africa, Madagascar, and so forth, not just this particular one. And yet the REAP people are no longer able, many of them who went through that first phase, to just get up and go. But they can stand up and give. They can be deliberate. This morning I read 2 Corinthians chapter 9. I read it in the Message. And there Eugene Peterson puts it really well, where he talks about Paul sending a team to make sure that his boasting about the Macedonians wouldn't be in vain, because he has said that they are going to be generous. So he sends people so that they can have a prepared, planned gift. I'm not asking people to spontaneously just do something out of guilt. I am challenging us to go to the next phase of kingdom living, which is to go beyond getting equipped to repurpose a business and go to a place where we can actually not just be generous, but we can be people who make deliberate investments that transform society. You don't need me to tell you the statistics about the trillions of dollars that sit in the investment accounts of believers, but it's not biblically responsible investing. It's just the regular investment vehicles. And so it gets put into things that are counter-kingdom. If you followed the trail, you would find sometimes that many of the investments of professing Christians are actually doing more harm than good, or not deliberately extending the kingdom of God. So you can read about that in other forums. My point is simply to say, look, I think we had a change of season 10 years ago. I didn't see it. I'm sorry. I should have seen it. And so what do we do now to play some catch up, to get into a place where we can actually work together to make investments? Over the last number of years, actually since 2006, God spoke to me about setting up a vehicle to handle such investments. And so I've created the Global Giants Foundation with an investment holding company underneath it, so that ring-fenced investments can be made in businesses, not on the basis of an industry or a technology or a geography even, but on the basis of what it takes to transform a society. So the filter is, what are the collection of entities that are needed to bring about transformation in a city or a nation? Which ones need investment? What kind of investment? Because there are many forms of capital. Intellectual capital, we get that. Spiritual capital, we understand that somewhat. And there's, of course, environmental capital, social capital, political capital, relational capital, many forms of capital. We've placed a premium value on financial capital. But the reality is, you cannot transform society without capital, holistic capital. And the purpose of the Global Giants Foundation is to actually invest holistically, to bring capital in all of its forms to inspired innovations that will bring about a transformation in society. So this is not a pitch for the Global Giants Foundation. This is just to say I have been thinking about this for a long time, but I've been remiss in encouraging my friends in the repurposing business community, in the REAP community, to begin setting aside the growing capital. Having already invested the going capital, now we need to see the growing capital, which can become the transforming capital. So take a look at this journey. So I've pulled out the chapter in the book. It's part 12 of the Transforming Society book, so that you can read it yourself, think it through, and see what God might be saying to you about this topic. Will you do that? Will you consider that? And will you, again, accept my apology for being 10 years behind in terms of seeing what God was doing? God bless you, and I look forward to hearing from you.